Hello and welcome to this panel discussion of the challenges and opportunities and outlook for Europe. I'd like to begin by introducing my panel members or asking them to introduce themselves. So perhaps we will start with Nicola, if you could give a brief introduction of yourself.
Yes, of course, no problem. So first of all, thank you very much for the opportunity. My name's Nicola Heffron. I'm head of Europe for Bluebird Bio. So I've been working for Bluebird Bio since the beginning of this year. So clearly not so much has happened. I'm joking. So lots of turbulent times, obviously with COVID. And my role has been to launch our novel gene therapy products across Europe. So that pretty much entails working with the teams on gaining market access, setting up qualified treatment centres, and ultimately treating patients. My background is a qualified pharmacist, qualified in the UK, as you can probably tell by my accent, and I've worked at a number of other pharmaceutical companies, most recently in the rare disease launching space. So I'm currently based over in Switzerland, in Zug, Switzerland, and very much look forward to taking part in this panel.
Thank you, Nicola. Perhaps Jackie, you'd like to go next?
Thanks, Christopher, and thanks very much for inviting me also. I'm Jacqueline Barry. I'm the Chief Clinical Officer at Cell and Gene Therapy Catapult. And for those of you that don't know what Catapult is, we're a not-for-profit organisation whose the aim of which is to promote the use of cell and gene therapies and to grow the industry, primarily in the UK. I'm in charge of what we would call the adoption team. So I look after the regulatory, the reimbursement, and the advanced therapy treatment centres that we have in the UK. So really looking at the translational pathway, how do we accelerate that? How do we actually assist in navigating through to adoption and payment of the treatments? The Catapult was set up in 2012. So we also look at the other challenges, which we may or may not touch on today. But, you know, how do you reduce the cost of goods? How do you standardise the manufacture, standardise the delivery? So we look at all of those challenges for the industry and hope to come up with solutions which we can then use to promote the industry.
Manuel.
Sure. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where our audience is located today. My name is Emanuele Ostuni. I'm responsible for launching all the oncology cell therapies of Novartis across Europe. My team brought the first CAR T therapy to market here in Europe. And we are responsible for both the front end, commercial, the medical part, as well as the logistics and operation part of delivering autologous cell therapies across Europe. I'm a chemist by training with many years spent all over the world in multiple roles in pharma, as well as in biotech startups and consulting.
Thank you. And I'm Christopher Vann. I'm the Chief Operating Officer and Commercial Leader for Autolus. Autolus is a UK biotech also working in the autologous CAR T cell space. We have our first programs actually entering into registration study phase. And so we're actually a little bit earlier in the process, and we're actually clearly beginning to gear up for the marketing of products globally. So I'm actually also very interested to hear from the panelists a little bit about where they are, as many of them are actually further along in the journey. Perhaps, Manuela, I can start with you. And clearly, Kymriah was the first product in the market. It's been in the market now for just over 2 years. How established is the market in terms of the access and delivery in Europe for CAR T cell therapy?
Thanks, Chris. Very happy to share experience. We are very happy with where we are so far. The therapy is available in 22 markets, either fully or partially reimbursed across Europe. And it's been so for about 6 months. So when you think about it, we launched in August of 2018, just over 2 years to get that level of adoption across Europe, which is actually far faster than many of our therapies normally get access to in Europe. So that's been really encouraging from our perspective. There's been a lot of logistical challenges that we overcame, and I know you want to touch on those at some point later on. What I found remarkable was that there was a lot of collaboration across many of the stakeholders in the ecosystem, not just the physicians, but also the payers, to actually figure out solutions to get these therapies to patients as fast as possible. And that was really the most important part. So that resulted not just in 22 countries, but also over 130 centers where patients can get access to these therapies. So it's, it's not in every hospital, but it's also not so rare to find a center that can deliver it, that patients have to go through tremendous hardships in order to get access to the therapies. And that's what we are very happy about, because ultimately we're trying to get this to as many patients as we can.
Thank you. And Nicola, Zyntalgo is clearly less time on the market, but also a slightly, somewhat different product in the sense that it's for rare diseases. How have you, with experience of both CAR-T and also rare diseases, beta thalassemia, how advanced is it in Europe in terms of the delivery of rare diseases? How do you contrast that with this CAR-T experience?
Yeah, so you're absolutely right. We're just a little bit further behind on the journey in terms of chronology and timing. And so I think overall, I'd say I'm really happy with the progress we're making. We're not quite at the same stage that Emanuele is with his access and his QTC setup. But for us, we have a slightly different business model. So as you've seen probably in the public domain, we've got some QTCs open in Germany now. And Germany was our first launch country, obviously because of the access situation in Germany. And we're still waiting on, obviously, the ADNOC process to finish in Germany. In terms of other countries, we are not able to finalize press the button on the final step of QTC setup until the reimbursement and access piece is completed. So we are in those reimbursement and access processes now throughout Europe, going very well. And at some point, as soon as we get the access, then we'll be able to finalize the treatment center agreements with the others. So ours is very much hinged on market access, and those conversations are happening literally as we speak. I think going pretty well. Obviously, gene therapy is a very new thing for many payers, and we can talk a little bit more about the reimbursement later and some of the challenges there. But I think I'm actually generally very happy with how it's progressing, and I think we're learning a lot as we go. So the earlier ones, the earlier setups of the QTCs, I think have been a great source of learning, and we're getting more and more efficient as we go in terms of how long it takes to set up, but also how to do it in the environment such as COVID, where we can't have full access to every customer we'd like to. So we're having to figure things out as we go in order to stay on track with the timing.
Great, thank you. And Jack, if I may turn to you, with your experience of the UK, what are countries like the UK doing in Europe in order to accelerate the access and availability of products, cell and gene therapy products?
Yeah, and I suppose it's a good thing if I focus on the UK initially, and just picking up on what the previous speakers have said. I do believe that these therapies does foster collaboration. I think people do work really hard to accelerate it through the pathway. I know that we worked with the commissioners in the UK, as did the companies, and the CAR-T products, such as Novartis product, were approved for use, and for use in the NHS, the National Health Service, within 2 weeks of the EMA approving them, which is astonishing. It truly is, and I think that sort of represents the willingness of the health service to move these along quickly, because they appreciate the urgent need for some of them. So I think that collaboration is something that as a community we should foster and draw upon. And we certainly spend a lot of time with the commissioners, with the payers, explaining the uniqueness of these, with the rare diseases. You're not going to have your full patient data set. How do we get around that? What do we look for? So we've spent a lot of time on that. And the other thing, we've been very lucky. The UK government has invested in Catapult, so they understand that advanced therapies do bring a unique, potentially a unique therapy to patients who may or may not have any other treatment options. But they also allowed us some money, 30 million UK pounds, to set up what we call a national advanced therapy treatment centre network. So Catapult is coordinating that, and we're working with treatment centres to, Nicola, picking up on your point. Each time you do it, you learn something new. Whereas actually, if you have a network that develop a process and procedures that then everyone uses, then you get over that, let's learn it once and then learn it again and again and again. You learn it once and it's rolled out. So I think that's a real strength that we've certainly tried to draw upon in the NHS. We do have a unified health service which we can draw upon, and we're just trying to standardise the delivery. In terms of other European countries, I don't think they've got that advanced therapy treatment centre network the way that we have in the UK. But I do know that they're working with, you know, the developers to try and accelerate it. But I don't think it's as coordinated perhaps as it is in the UK, as far as I understand.
So clearly, after a relatively slower start than, say, the US in terms of clinical trials, things have really picked up on pace as products have come to market. And it would be fair to say, I think, that we would all agree that the delivery and treatment access in the Europe is very much established for the first products, and is clearly accelerating for other advanced cell and gene therapy products. One of the things that I've heard that people have a strong view that we could actually do in order to accelerate that adoption might be to work on what I would call harmonization. I think people like Jackie would call conformity, which is bringing standards closer together. So Emmanuel, perhaps you can give us your view on whether that would be a good idea and which areas you think we should be focusing on.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. I think that's I think it's a good point, especially based on what we hear from physicians, in the sense that, you know, with the first couple of therapies, there was obviously a rush to get ready and provide options to patients quickly. I think now that, you know, the dust is settling on a lot of that, I think it's fair that we are asking questions. I think physicians are asking questions. And the questions come around, do we need, you know, a different set of approval processes for delivering these therapies for every single one that comes along? Do we need, you know, different ways of handling cells for every different therapy? I think that there's a balance there because we all manufacture differently. You know, do we need different standards for ordering products? So I think there's a lot of potential there going forward, that, you know, we could draw learnings from other industries, other therapies that have come, like bone marrow transplantation, for example. But there's I think a need for us to look at this as an industry, but in collaboration with the stakeholders or the physicians here, to come up with something that might make more sense to all of us, in order to let the field move forward. Otherwise, we risk having a lot of fragmentation and a lot of different little things that we all do that don't really help the final outcome, and it may ultimately get in the way of access of patients, as well as you know, a broader adoption across the region and globally speaking.
Great, thank you. And Nicola, building upon that, obviously in the rare disease space, you have an additional challenge, which is you never know whether disease is actually going to arise and be treated. And you obviously have centers who may not be having, you know, monthly or even daily, you know, 6 monthly experience of using the product. So, you know, in terms of the treatment center and the delivery of the products, what specific challenges do you have, and what do you think we can do to actually overcome those challenges?
Yeah, absolutely. So just on that point about I guess the number of QTCs, we're always thinking what is the right number in each country to I guess avoid a situation where you've got a treatment center open and no patients, right? Because that isn't good for anybody. So we're trying to kind of exactly figure out what we need. So we hopefully never get in a situation where we go 6 months without seeing any patients. But from our perspective, standardization is a huge opportunity, and it is very high on our agenda as Bluebird, certainly. And as we move into 2021, my own personal agenda across Europe, we got to get to a better place with this. We did a piece of work recently that looked at how many gene and cell products are coming through over the next sort of 3 to 5 years, and we could be facing up to 100 new products coming through. Right now, they're not 100 new companies with 100 new processes, but you've got to be thinking there's got to be a lot. And the QTCs are our customers. We want to work well with them, and this doesn't help them. So there's kind of three areas that we're specifically looking at. The first area is our kind of tools, I guess, how we configure our IT systems in order to safely and effectively track bags of cells to patients. And you know, if every company's got their own IT tool, that's a very practical challenge. The other piece that Emanuele just mentioned, which is around auditing, not only the setup process for auditing, but also the ongoing auditing process. You know, if Bluebird's got one, and maybe Novartis has got one, and many other companies, we're all jumping on these QTCs saying, hey, look, we've got different processes and they're all running at different times. And we want them to spend their time doing what they do best, right? Which is looking after patients and doing their normal work. And I think the final area we're looking at is around labeling and how we label our products, again, to be logical. I know many hospitals should use this IBMT classification for their labels. As part of our process, we kind of stick our label on top, right? That kind of makes no sense. So we got to figure this out. So have we done it yet? No. But is there a huge opportunity? Yes. And I think what we do now will really help for many years to come. Question is, how do we do this? You know, as an industry, how do we organize ourselves? And I know that the Catapult group have been very good and very active in this space, and maybe Jacqueline can talk about that. But there's obviously a kind of pan-European approach here that we'd be very much looking forward to be part of and helping move that along.
And if I could add to that, Chris, real quick, I mean, I think on the cell collection standards, that's another one that's a big one, because we all have different ones. That one is a tricky one because it requires also a regulatory component to enable that simplification, because you know all of our dossiers are linked to how we collect. So you know that's where it's not just the manufacturers or the physicians. We also need the regulators at the table to have that conversation and to streamline it for the benefit of the whole system.
Totally agree with you, Emanuele. That's absolutely right. There's so many different parts to this. You could see how it needs to be coordinated, though, for sure.
So I think it's very encouraging. The three of us have talked before that there is now, I think, you know, 2 years ago when we had these discussions amongst companies, there was probably, because people were focusing on launching their products, there was no appetite to actually move them forward. But clearly there's now both a desire and a need to do so. So turning to you, Jackie, I mean, the other side of this, of course, is what we would like to do is to try to get conformity amongst manufacturers, but it's also going to be very important to get conformity amongst countries, no more so than in Europe, where you obviously have a lot of countries to deal with. So maybe you can give us some thoughts on both how countries are approaching this nationally, but then equally how we might then start building some kinds of international consensus.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. I think it's really important that we do this internationally. I think you're absolutely right. So I'll give you an example of what we're doing in the UK. Nicola mentioned it. So as part of the Advanced Therapy Treatment Centre network, we have an industry advisory group of over 50 members, with all the people on this call and many, many more. And my background is blood transfusion, so I was quite well placed to understand the constraints at the clinical side, but also as a regulatory person, the constraints from your dossiers. So I think the first part was actually getting both sides to understand the strengths of each other and the constraints. And I think once people understand that, it's so much easier to move forward. So now we're working effectively, and actually all the points that we picked up, we're looking through the ATTCs, we're looking at standardization of labeling, standardization of transport, standardization of auditing, and we have this program called SAMPLE, which is standardization of collection of starting materials. And I think it's crucial that the industry is working on that and understanding that actually, just because you've always said that you have to do 2 blood volumes, it maybe isn't perhaps the best thing to do. Maybe you could go to get the required numbers of cells, whatever way you need to do it. So I think understanding the constraints and the expertise is something we should draw upon. In terms of doing it internationally, obviously the standards coordinating body is working on this, and we're working really closely with them and ICBA on the ISBT 128 label changes for cell therapy apheresis collection. But as you say, Nicola, if you then just slap a label on top, that's not going to help. Really not. So that's where I think we all have to be pragmatic and come together. And picking up on what Emmanuel said, I think we have engaged with the EBMT, we've engaged with the regulators, and the EMA is aware of this. And actually it's the Commission, it's the European Commission that needs to be cognizant of it also. And I do think that this is where we should come together as an industry and say, this is really easy to fix. We've got JC and FACT standards, which everybody has to comply with. Then we've got regional nice to haves. Then we've got the dossier on top of that. What actually is the core requirement? And then work up from there. But that takes working together. But from what I understand, everyone really wants to work together on this because it's going to solve the problem for everyone. So that's where we are using our industry advisory group to move it along. But that international element, Chris, that you mentioned is absolutely what we require. And there's no point doing it in Europe if the US is going in a different direction, for instance.
Yeah.
Right.
Certainly, oh, sorry.
Nicola, please.
I was just going to say we're very grateful for the work that Jacqueline and her team are doing, you know, obviously on a UK side, but the ability to, you know, if we could clone you across the world, that would just be amazing. So your reach, you know, enabling your reach is something that would be really helpful to us as an industry, because what you're doing is you're being that independent arbiter of all the different groups and stakeholders, and that is exactly what we need. So thank you.
Well, actually picking up on that, what we do want to do, and I think we're best placed to do it in some ways because the NHS is one organisation, is if we can solve it at a UK level, but with an international outlook, then you can simply roll it out, or you can, you know, you can
It's a blueprint,
draw upon, it's an exemplar almost in how you might be able to do it. But we need to work internationally. We need to be told what isn't going to work, what is going to work. And that's where it's key that we hear from yourselves.
So clearly, I think we all see both a real desire to drive to some degree of conformity of standards. I think there's also a great recognition that that has to be obviously across industry, but also it needs to be across countries. So I think it's great that the UK is actually working on what it believes is most core and essential for its own national criteria for delivery of products and other standards. But I think it's also great that there's an openness then to engage internationally, both at the European and global level, to actually have that one standard, which I think we would all see as being quite important in terms of reducing hurdles for adoption. It does raise, however, I think the one interesting thing that I've always found about working in Europe is you are essentially working in around 27 countries. So we've talked about standardization for some of the key areas like the delivery of the products. Manuela, what other challenges do you think there are working across borders in Europe, and how may we address some of the key ones?
Yeah, how long do we have in terms of the list? You know, it's actually a long list of things that goes anywhere from something that may seem as mundane as you know, tissue standards for exporting blood products across borders to you know, standards for transport of medical material on airplanes. We sometimes have our doors dropped by the airlines because they don't think it's as important as a passenger's luggage. So, you know, all the way to, you know, how do different bodies across Europe recognize the releases and approvals that different countries give. right? To give you an example, we have several manufacturing sites in Europe, but they are granted and they are governed by the laws of those countries where they sit. You would think that, an approval gained in France should count across Europe and would allow for easy transport across. And sometimes that is not the case. Sometimes there isn't full reciprocity around some of these agreements. So we see strange things sometimes. Even we have one site in Switzerland, but it needs to go through a whole other set of discussions if we're moving product out of Switzerland into other countries. The devil is in the details with these sorts of things, but it's the whole area of import-export across borders is a big one, as well as how do we stand up in terms of quality releases between different countries for the rest of Europe. I think those two are big enough as a starting point, and before we get to the rest of the list.
And clearly, do you anticipate that the winter will be more difficult because of COVID, particularly with things like airlines?
I think at this point, having absorbed the shock of March through May, I think we know enough to manage. What I don't know, and I don't think most of us do, is depending on which will be the preferred vaccine mode. Some of these vaccines require cryo shipping or cold shipping, and that's going to actually throw a pretty reasonable wrench in the global supply chain logistics field, and I just don't know how that's going to impact everything else. I would hope that will happen through dedicated air vessels, meaning that the rest of the supply chain for cell therapies doesn't get disrupted. I think at this point, like I said, we know how to manage through some of this, and fortunately, it looks like air traffic is on the rise, which for us means more options for delivering the product as fast as we can. Cargo flights don't move as quickly, right?
And certainly we're all cognizant of the need that if we can have support and understanding of the people involved in the supply chain, whether it's the customs people, the airports, etc., to actually give priority and smooth the passage of our products across borders, that would be clearly very important to us as we move forward. Nicola, from your perspective, what are the challenges that working across borders has in Europe, and where would you focus on improving those?
So I definitely highlight the ones that Emmanuel has just highlighted, because they are an issue, and we are still kind of figuring out the whole tax VAT thing and how that works, transferring blood product. The area that's probably the biggest priority, and again a biggest opportunity for us, is around cross-border access. So access to medicines. Given the rare nature of our diseases, we are unlikely to open QTCs in every single country across Europe. So ultimately, if we have patients to care for, we will have to rely on some form of cross-border mechanism to be able to allow that to happen. Today, we have this, I think it's called the SQ pathway, which is a pathway originally designed to enable people living in Europe but not in their home country to access medicines as part of, I guess, European directive. But it's not really set up for gene and cell treatment. I know there's been a number of, well, one product that's tried this pathway out, putting a QTC in Italy and then trying to cross-border patients in. I think that's had varying different levels of success. And we can foresee some challenges here. So from our side, what we're trying to understand is, first of all, is this pathway fit for purpose for gene and cell therapy? And maybe it's not. Maybe we need to think about alternative routes to allow this. But if it is, how can we speed it up? Because in some countries, the pathway can take 2 weeks, in some countries, months. And if you've got a disease that needs, pretty immediate treatment, that could be the difference between life or death choice for a patient. So we have to figure out the timings. We also have to figure out reimbursement pathways as well. So if patients are treated urgently, how does a country know, a home country know that they are going to get reimbursed, for example, if this cross-border? So this is an area that we are very much partnering with a number of different industry bodies to work out how can we figure this out, because it's the best thing for a patient to have these expert centres concentrated and become almost power users for different medicines, so they get the experience, and that will mean some mobility of patient. So that is definitely a big challenge for us, in addition to Emanuele's.
And maybe, Chris, could I add something to this one? Because this is a big one we see as well. We have seen quite a bit of travel among some patients. What we're learning as we go through is that many patients and patient groups aren't fully aware and clear, even on that pathway that Nicola is describing, which has its own challenges, but at least it's there, right? We find it's not even fully as well understood by some of the patient groups. And sometimes it's missing the governmental support and backing to make it happen. We've also heard cases where some hospitals and governments weren't trusting of the other ministries and governments backing these patients, believe it or not, because in some cases they would call those abuses. So there is a place for that conversation to take place, and maybe even something as big as a European fund that actually allows this to happen in a more clear way.
Absolutely. And also patient groups for sure, and patients, but even the physicians, I don't think are fully aware. And you know what, why should they be, right? It's not one of the most common things they have to do. So, you know, there is an education piece, but I still have a question in my mind. Is it better to get this pathway up and running and able to cope with gene therapies and cell therapies, or do we need to think about changing the game completely? And creating something, back to your point about the pot or a pathway or something. So again, I guess this is also something we're working through, but it has to be a key priority for patients.
And similarly, by the way, Autolus has a similar experience with our T-cell lymphoma program. It's in clinical trials, but again, it's one of those diseases which, you know, there isn't that many available treatments for, so people are going to travel, and we are going to definitely need solutions for them. Jackie, you were going to add something.
No, I was just going to, I was actually going to suggest what Emmanuel did in the end as well, but I think it comes back to what we were saying before. It's all to do with collaboration, and in this case it would be collaboration between the European member state governments. You know, I think if they can have European grants to cover, you know, various activities that span Europe, surely a pot that is available for the treatment of patients Europe-wide would be something, you know, not obviously it would be for rare cases. You couldn't do it for you know, general medicines, but this is something that you think the European Union could get behind and could support, because they do a lot of cross-border initiatives, transferring students between universities, or, you know. So is it that really that different? So I think it comes down to that, again, the collaboration that's driven by the acute clinical need. It's quite easy, I suppose.
Yeah, it's easy to say. I think I love your example with the students. I think when you've got obviously a ton of people, it makes sense. I guess certainly in my world with the rare diseases, if you've only maybe got 10 or 20 patients across Europe a year, that's where I think the voice isn't being heard, or maybe there's no organisation. So I think for that, absolutely, but there has to be a way to crack this. There has to. And I remain convinced, and we certainly would like to have a seat at the table to help push that on behalf of patients, for sure.
And I think, sorry, Chris, just one last idea here. In some countries, this works at a country level, right, where you have a dedicated fund for rare diseases and advanced therapies. So, and it's a similar way of, you know, this simply expands that. You know, it exists in the UK, it exists in Italy. And you know, it's a way of saying Europe-wide, you know, everyone contributes, everyone benefits, and there's an easy accounting that can be done at the end of the year to say, you know, who put in more than they got or who got more than they put in. You know, that's should be one of the benefits of the union, right? So,
yeah, no offense to the UK.
no.
Yeah, we're going to have another thought there. We're going to figure that one.
Mm-hmm.
Which actually brings us nicely to every meeting about Europe always has one Brexit question. So I'll actually have a very quick question for Jackie, and I'll only ask Jackie this, but in what terms do you expect Brexit to have a significant impact on the UK in its context of being obviously a European country outside of the EU?
Yeah, becoming a third party member state. I think I'm going to answer this very much from the point of view of ATMPs, advanced therapies, because there are going to be problems. There's almost potentially a double impact, because you've got your starting material needing transported between member states and your finished product being transported between member states. However, I think if we think we do this between the US and Europe already, it's possible. We all do it. It's easy-ish. So I think these things can be overcome if we can agree and mutually recognize the procedures that are in place. And if there's equivalence, it should be fine. I suppose the other way that I've been looking at it is, as we've just been talking about, there's a real patchwork of regulations and considerations for Europe. And one thing that we might be able to do in the UK is to smooth that landscape, you know, the difference between a tissue and a medicinal product. And maybe, while staying equivalent, perhaps provide an easier pathway in terms of GMO tissue collection. So I think there might be possibilities for acceleration of it within the UK, while staying absolutely aligned to the directives. But long term, I think it's something that it's going to be a short term issue, but I think with equivalence, all three of you are sat in Switzerland. There's drugs going in and out of Switzerland to Europe all of the time. You know, it's not that different. So I think short term, I think it's going to be a headache, but longer term, I think equivalence will be there, and we'll be able to accelerate what we can do within the UK as well. So I'm hopeful.
So I would agree. As Autolus, for those of you who don't know, is actually a UK manufacturer. So I think some of the concerns we have around uncertainty and certainly what we would hate to see is a divergence of standards, which we talked about earlier, because that's not good for anyone in this field. However, the UK, from my perspective, will maintain a good place to do clinical trials, good place to do a number of activities related to cell and gene therapy. So I'm actually optimistic, but I think that the thing that's actually going to be most problematic in the short term is the uncertainty around the immediate future. And clearly we're addressing that, for example, by building inventory of the raw materials we use to manufacture a product. There's a number of steps we can take to actually lessen that risk. But I think that, one of the key things is actually going to be able to remove some of that uncertainty, and there might even be some opportunities in the future with regard to, working more closely, for example, with the MHRA. I think the rest of those is worth another 3-hour discussion on another day. I'm sure we'll have it at some stage. But it's one country within the European sphere, but it's by no means the only one. So perhaps we can move on to some other topics. Manuela, you've been through the regulatory approval process. Maybe you can give us some feedback on how well that works in Europe, and then what are the challenges for a product that's already on the market?
Sure. So I think the first thing I would say is we're very grateful to both EMA and FDA, because getting the first cell therapies to approval needed a lot of collaboration there as well. We were writing the book together as these products were going through the approval process. So that was remarkable. And I think the agency stepped up and made sure that things could be done also within a time frame that made sense, given the life-saving curative potential of some of these products. So that, I think, was a great first step. I think as you look further and you look at both the large number of companies and products coming through, as Nicola mentioned, but also at how manufacturing innovation is as important as product innovation going forward to ensure faster, greater availability of these products, the process by which we make them will change dramatically for the better, is the hope. And so as a result of it, there will be questions there around, how do we handle that from a regulatory perspective? Because to apply some of the older standards may not make sense, but we need to start thinking about the doctrine of bioequivalence with some of these products, and ensure that we can innovate the processes faster, because that's critical for the industry and ultimately for ensuring greater access and faster access for patients. So that hand-in-hand collaboration and work needs to continue going forward on an ongoing basis, because what we just went through is step one of a 1,000-step journey for cell therapies globally. And there's a lot that still has to get worked out in order to enable that. So we're really looking forward to greater collaboration long-term with the agencies to make sure that we can keep innovating on all fronts of the product, and make sure that we can do it within a time frame that makes sense for patients ultimately.
And I couldn't agree with you more, because obviously the process that you take forward to market may actually be further enhanced as you learn more about the key characteristics of the product. And each batch is an individual product. But I think the other challenge we're also going to have, and it's going to be quite interesting to see how the regulators cope with that, is one of the things we do in Autolus, for example, is we add additional programming modules which add additional features to the product. And it takes line extensions to a whole different level in terms of actually identifying what would actually, what constitutes what level of evidence that you're going to need to show in order to maintain and extend your label. Becky, I know this is an area you've been doing some work in, so what's the current thinking in terms of where we stand and what we need to do in order to try to unravel some of these challenges?
I'm going to bring it back to collaboration again, because it's what Manuel said. If you're working with the regulators and explaining to them your uniqueness of the challenge that's coming, it allows them, because they're learning, it allows them to question it, to go off and discuss it. And I think in Europe, as we all know, this 27, used to be 28 member states, sat around the table discussing what's required for, as you say, a line extension. So I think the collaboration and ARM's very good there at meeting with the regulators, explaining what's coming down the path and allowing them to come up with solutions is critical. And again, as an industry, we should be doing that together. We should be working together to say, we found this out already. This is a solution, let's share, because it makes it easier for everyone. And I know that the MHRA, for instance, are really quite active in acknowledging that these therapies are really quite unique, and that they need to have a more flexible way to look at it. The European agency, the EMA, has the certification for non-clinical and quality that you can receive. I think a handful of people have used that. If you could have that, and you could have a truly rolling review process, which Prime, introduces, and Adaptive Pathway introduces, but truly, phone up somebody, you get an answer the next day, you ask them to come out and do an inspection of your facilities, whether that be GCP facilities, because that's actually one of the big problems about how do you do the clinical trials, or GMP facilities. So I think the MHRA, as an example of a regulator in Europe, is actively looking at that. How do we adapt as the products adapt? Because this variation's taken so long. it's going to slow access to patients. But again, question and answer, how do we do it? We work together, we work with the regulators. And we actually, I've written down, do we need to almost start having, ARM used to try and have regular meetings in the regulatory section of ARM. We used to try and meet with the regulators quite often to say, this is a real issue. We're not asking for a solution, but we're just outlining the issue. So perhaps the industry needs to do that more.
And I think myself and my colleagues have found the European regulators very open for engagement, and clearly we're all learning the science as we develop our products. So I think there is a desire to actually maintain up-to-date expert knowledge and to engage in these, frankly quite complex issues. Nicola, I imagine your experience from our previous discussions with the regulators has also been very favorable, but I'd like you to maybe share some of that and then maybe also move on to the next stage of the process, of course, which is reimbursement, and what have been the key learnings there, and what do you think are ways in which we can work more effectively in Europe?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I think from our side, again, just to reiterate, we've had within the European interactions very positive conversations, and it has all been based upon that collaboration and actually writing the rule book as we go a little bit in collaboration with the regulators. Things like the prime designation, that pathway has been particularly helpful, with the opportunity to have early engagement with the regulators, to start that dialogue early, and also to shape the studies, the phase 3 studies, in a way that would be best for gaining effective and quick approval for patients, especially in these higher unmet needs areas. So I think that's been very good. And then the other piece is obviously having things like conditional approval has also been a fantastic opportunity for us. What I would say though is when you've got things like conditional approval and prime designation, it feels like the regulators are thinking quicker than the payers in a way, in that they're enabling these products to get to market. And we've seen plenty of examples fairly recently where products have got to market only to get big challenges when it comes to payers, because they've been approved on maybe not the full data package through the conditional approval process, and then access grinds to a halt. So what we need to be able to do is to get to a point where we've got almost the equivalent of conditional approval for, gosh, my blinds have just automatically shut, so if you wonder why I'm speaking. This is live TV, guys. I'll carry on and then I'll put them back up again. You don't need to see me. Oh, there we go. I don't see me anyway. Yeah, so I think the ability to get them approved is important. But if you don't have a full recognition of the value, so for example, you're launching a gene therapy that potentially could have lifetime benefit, but you don't have that evidence today, great to get approved, but very difficult then to get into a conversation with a payer and have that discussion. So I think this is where Bluebird, I think, has been quite innovative, and actually I know a number of other companies are working this way too, in terms of thinking about risk share, entering risk share arrangements, where even if we don't have all the data today, we believe so strongly in our medicine, we're prepared to put a significant portion of the price at risk upon evidence over time, and that's something we've been talking about for quite some years in the public domain. So that's one piece, the pay for performance. The other aspect where I think there's more opportunity for innovation is payment over time, and again that's another area that we're having active live conversations with payers now. If there are countries where there are particularly high epidemiology of rare diseases, then it's even more important that we partner with our payers to think about how could this work for them. So all of those aspects I think are super important, and the ability to then cap any need to pay over time after that evaluation period, so that the countries know their full financial exposure is super important. So are we there yet? No. We have some principles that we're trying to sort of actively talk about, such as risk share, real true payment for performance, the ability to pay over time, capping payments. But how that looks at a country by country level really does depend on the local country EPI, the healthcare system set up, how their budgets are, whether it's a nationalised healthcare system or an insurance-based, and it's still very much watch this space. But again, I'm super encouraged by the creativity that's happening on the ground So there is some creativity and some willingness to do this.
I think, yes, I think we're all experiencing the will to find a solution. I think the key issue is for us is actually going to also be to administer some degree of processes to support that. So, you know, one of the examples being, for example, in the UK, that the Treasury rules don't allow a rollover of commitment from one year to another. So clearly there's some work on a national basis as well as an international basis to actually try to enable the right appropriate environment to support these types of innovative solutions. Manuela, would you like to add anything to this?
Yeah, I would say that on the ground, you know, we have a reimbursement in 22 countries. I would say that no arrangement is the same among the 22. What is common is that there's a recognition of the value that the therapies can bring. But besides that, our approach has been to sit down and say, what do you need, right? What is going to make sense? Because to Nicholas' point, different patient numbers, different budget impacts, different needs. As long as that value was recognized, we could find a way. You know, we were willing to be creative and not be constrained by short-term quarterly revenue type considerations versus simply saying, if the value is there, how do we capture it? Is it over multiple years? Is it one time? Is it risk share? Like I said, 22 countries, 22 arrangements that still recognize the value but meet the local needs.
I think just to add to that as well, there's a difference when you're looking at rare diseases and you've got a prevalence pool relative to an incident as well. So if you're having new patients come every year, I guess similar to the CAR-T experience, it's a different set of dynamics if you've got a pot of patients that are prevalent and that, you know, maybe the country has the goal to get to the point where they can perhaps not eradicate but significantly reduce that population. So every system needs some flexibility, that's for sure.
So we're running close to time now. So what I'd like to do is give each of you a chance to give your final thoughts, bearing in mind that a number of our audience will be people who are not active in Europe. What would be your advice about engaging Europe from a perspective of developing and marketing products, advanced cell and gene therapy products in Europe? Maybe we start with you, Emanuela.
Tall order. I spent 22 years in the US and I am a passport carrier as well. So I'm happy to be able to say the one that says that Europe is not one country. That actually offers a lot of benefits in terms of establishing a business. It has its own peculiarities that must be understood in order to do business here, but it also offers some interesting potential. The uniform government payer being one of them that allows for much more creative reimbursement arrangements than is possible sometimes in other parts of the world. So from that perspective, I think a lot of interesting things can and should happen in Europe, as already have happened in Europe. Yeah, I think that's the most important message. I also think that from a clinical trial infrastructure, the clinicians here are very willing and able to engage. Sometimes we forget Europe and clinical trial plans, but I think it's time to relook at Europe and make sure that it's very well represented, especially given how lopsided some of the clinical trial distributions are in gene and cell therapies at the moment. So I would really welcome a lot more investment on that part here, and that investment paves the way to figure out all the things that we just discussed, so that when launches take place, the road is already cleared for them.
And Jackie, perhaps you next.
Yeah, I was actually going to say something similar. I think what Europe allows, especially the clinical trial space, is it allows you to probe all the potential problems you may encounter when you get to licensure. And you can do that quite effectively because you're in very different environments, which you also have in the US, you know, but it does throw up the things that you have to consider when you want to roll out to everyone, you know, in a licensed way. And in the UK, we do 12% of all global ATMP trials, which is quite a lot for a small country. You know, so I think having that expertise, people understanding and having the confidence to use these products, actually, you learn an awful lot from that. You learn the solutions as well as the problems. And also, I think there's a willingness to, each regulator has its own strengths and weaknesses in their thought processes. And I think if you can use the various places in Europe to look at your development, look at the potential issues, look at the patient safety issues potentially, it gives you a much more rounded and robust development plan. And I think that's invaluable as you go on, especially even from an early stage. It's not just, you know, the well-established companies. I think even small spin-outs really early in their development learn a lot by going through Europe. Whereas if they only went to, say, the US, they might miss something. So I think, just as Emmanuela said, there's a lot of strength there and a lot of knowledge, and it's useful to draw upon it.
Thank you. And Nicola?
Yeah, I mean, I guess really just to pile on what's been said, I think, well, certainly for us, we've got plenty of patients in Europe as well. So from an epidemiology perspective, you know, there's lots of opportunity to help patients independently of the US. And we are in quite an interesting situation that we are launching here in Europe first, which is not normally the way these things happen. So to the points that have been raised, Europe, for us and for me, has been this really cool test bed where we are trying lots of really innovative ideas out. You know, some work, some not so much, and we're getting great learning from setting up our QTCs. I guess the key thing here is making sure we are able to quickly pivot and pass those learnings back to the organisation. So I think if you were sat in the US today and you've got a European organisation, I would be thinking, you know, how do we make sure that there's great communication between these guys to take these learnings and to work out as an organisation how we all pivot and how we take on you know, the good experiences and the not so good experiences across Europe. And that's certainly how we are, you know, we're very well networked with our US colleagues saying, okay, this is what we learned this week, so that we were a learning organisation. And even though, you know, not everything we do works, I know that learning organisations and learning functions work over time. So it might be a little bit of the hare and the tortoise, but this experience in Europe is absolutely invaluable to making us, and also, I guess, all organisations in the gene and cell space much stronger as we go forward, much more able to help patients.
Thank you. I mean, I echo all of your sentiments, which is, it would be fair to say that Europe has really very much caught up with the US in the last 2-3 years, particularly. The title that we were given as Europeans was the challenges of working in Europe. I would actually argue that there are probably as many opportunities as challenges, but I think one of the key elements to Emmanuela's point and to Nicola's point is this is a test bed, and this is a location where you can actually come and learn a lot, but you actually have to engage early in order to maximize the value of that learning. So the final thing I'd like to do is I'd like to thank each of you for both your time and for contributing so openly your expertise. We obviously as a panel hope that the discussion has been useful and informative for all of the listeners to this presentation, and we wish you all a very good day. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. Bye.